In 1922, the Soviet Union was formed, a new nation that would have a profound impact on the entire globe. It would emerge from the remnants of the Russian Empire after a long and bloody civil war.
Russia, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, was a country in absolute turmoil, a brutal and bloody clash of arms trying to wipe out this new regime before it can take control of the country.
The Bolsheviks finally succeeded in about 1922, and then came the hard work of trying to create, for the first time ever, a new socialist country.
From out of nowhere, Vladimir Lenin had become the leader of the largest nation on earth and was now imposing his will.
Lenin won the war. Lenin won the revolution. Lenin's one of those amazing figures who really are decisive in history. One's got to understand that Lenin was an autocratic character who really didn't want anyone to succeed him. That's true of most autocratic characters in history.
But Lenin would have a successor who proved to be the most ruthless of all figures when dealing with both his own people and his foreign enemies.
They realized after the revolution that the Soviet Union was surrounded by enemies. It didn't have a friend in the world. They felt that way, and they were probably right. And the only defense was to build an enormous army with a lot of tanks and a lot of aircraft and a lot of ships, which they did.
In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviet Union emerged as a new global superpower that matched the once mighty Russian Empire of old.
All of us who were then young, we were seeing great achievements by the Soviet Union. They launched the Sputnik satellite, fantastic scientific achievement. They put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, fantastic achievement. And so people were saying they saw the Soviet Union as a genuine, comparable competitor with the United States.
Now, a century from its formation, the Soviet Union seems to define the whole of the 20th century. In 1917, the Romanov dynasty fell, and Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks had managed to seize power in the Russian Revolution. This new government signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers, bringing an end to Russian involvement in World War I. But despite an end to the conflict with foreign governments, the battle for Russia itself would continue for years.
In the beginning, it seemed fairly simple. It seemed to be the Red Army, which was an army of soldiers with hardly any officers, and the other army is the White Army, which you could say was an army of officers with hardly any soldiers, who wanted to put Russia back to what it had been before the First World War and possibly continue that war to a victory. And then it got complicated.
For really the better part of 2-3 years, this struggle is taking place for control of this vast and completely turbulent country. At the same time, other things are going on. There is a famine. There's a war going on between Russia and Poland at the same time. And there are endless mutinies, rebellions taking place, notably the Kronstadt mutiny, where the sailors of the fleet rebel against the new Bolshevik government. So not only is the Bolshevik government fighting for its very survival, but it's fighting against powerful and disparate forces, all of whom have one goal, and that is destroy it.
Various national groups formed their own armies, the Ukrainians, the Georgians, and they all fought. There was an anarchist army which fought all sides, sometimes allying with one. So basically red and white, with various other factions, and of course from 1919, the Japanese, the French, the British, and the Americans all thought they might intervene and save something from the situation. So there were at least 5 or 6 foreign armies also, mostly fighting the Bolsheviks and trying to help the whites, but in the end giving up, because The presence of foreign soldiers only made the Red Army stronger. It increased national feeling among the peasants and the workers.
But while Lenin, as the overall leader of the Bolsheviks, and Trotsky, as the leader of the Red Army, wound up victorious in the Russian Civil War, it was another figure who truly established himself during the fighting.
Lenin and Trotsky are now firmly in power. The Cheka is abolished. In its place comes the OGPU, or Political Police. And to check on the OGPU, there is Rob Kreen, the Workers' and Peasants Inspection Group, whose chief is one Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili. Party name, Stalin.
Well, Stalin was born in Georgia, one of the national areas of the Russian Empire. He was the son of a shoemaker. Initially, he was intended to go into the church. He attended a seminary. He joined the Bolsheviks at a young age, and he became known for his practical work, working in the underground, organizing bank robberies and political demonstrations. He spent a few years abroad, but he was mainly an inside guy. And in the course of the Civil War, he became in charge of all of the Bolshevik cadres, the organization, and he developed a patronage network in that way. So then he became obviously one of the potential successors to Lenin.
Everyone underestimated him because he pretended to be not as clever as he was. He pretended not to know foreign languages. He pretended not to have read anything. So they thought, this is a useful gopher. He'll do as a sort of chief whip to get others into organization. And when they founded a central committee, they thought, well, what's the most boring job on a committee? It's a secretary. But the point is that the secretary, if they have enough personality and power and ruthlessness, is the person who determines what the agenda is, who is going to receive that agenda, who is going to be notified of the meeting, and who is going to be allowed to speak, and who writes the notes, and so on. So as a result of that, right to the end of the Soviet Union, the most powerful person was the first secretary of the Central Committee, not the president, not the chairman. And that was Stalin's doing.
One of Stalin's key tasks in the Bolshevik Party had been how the issue of the nationalities that made up the Russian Empire would be handled by this new regime.
You know, his interest in the nationalities and the creation of the Soviet Union was that Lenin appointed him in 1911, 1912 to be his nationalities expert. And Stalin went to Vienna and lived there for a few months and wrote his paper on the nationalities question, which him and Lenin worked out what to do with the nationalities. You've got to understand that the Russian Empire was a multi-ethnic empire. It contained something like 100 tiny ethnic groups, but obviously a handful of big ones. The biggest of them, of course, was the Russians themselves, Orthodox Russians. But then there were Poles who were Catholic, Finns who were Protestant, Georgians who had their own church, Azeris and Chechens who were Muslim. So the big question in the Russian Empire was, how do we overthrow the Tsar, and how do we liberate these peoples?
The problem of national minorities had been a thorny one throughout Europe. Woodrow Wilson decided the solution was to allow national groups to self-determine themselves and create nations if they wanted to. Russia was a multinational empire, so the problem was how to organize the different nationalities. And Lenin decided that nationalities should have their own homelands, that the Soviet Union would be socialist in content, nationalist in form. And so the republics were formed along these national lines.
So he'd retaken and reconquered Ukraine and Belarus. He'd retaken the Caucasus, including Georgia, Stalin's homeland. But he'd lost the Baltics states, which became independent. He'd lost Finland and he'd lost Poland. So how does he manage the rest of this empire? And what does he do with these nationalities? Because the Bolsheviks have supported their right to freedom. And all of them have their own nationalist movements now, and all of them would, really like to be independent. That was the big question. What do we do? What kind of new country do we create to keep these territories within our new Soviet Bolshevik state and yet give them freedom? And that's the million-ruble question.
In December of 1922, The solution that the Bolsheviks enacted was the creation of a federal system of republics known as the USSR.
The name comes from the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It was a union of quasi-independent, nominally independent republics. It was Soviet because the political form was elected councils. The Russian word for council is Soviet. It was socialist because the state owned the means of production.
To begin with, they had the Russian Federal Republic, which still exists. There was a Ukrainian Republic once they'd entered Ukrainian independence, which lasted until about 1920. And there was a Caucasian Republic, which later split into Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Central Asia was still in chaos till 1924, and the present stands, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, they didn't really emerge until the middle of the 1920s, when they'd been pacified.
There were great differences between Lenin and Stalin about this new union of socialist republics. Lenin saw it as a decentralized system, with each socialist republic having considerable power over their own affairs. Stalin saw it very differently. He wanted it ruled from the center. He wanted Russia as the dominant force, Moscow as the center of power, and preferably himself running the whole thing. It was quite surprising, given that he himself was Georgian.
At the same time as this new state was being established, its leader was falling into a terrible state of health. A series of strokes would render Lenin unable to speak, and a new leader would soon be needed. One man had long been plotting for the position, and he would eventually become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the whole world. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died. The battle for succession of leadership in the Soviet Union was now truly underway, with one man, Stalin, determined to come out on top.
And then on January 21st, 1924, the moon-faced, balding dictator left the scene as abruptly as he had appeared. He literally died of overwork. His funeral was a monstrous affair. Hundreds of thousands queued up in the streets in 25 degree below zero weather. It seemed that everyone wanted to pay their last respects.
Stalin removed his rivals systematically with incredible ingenuity and in such a way they didn't know it was happening.
Lenin's great fear, I think, was that Stalin would develop a personality cult, a cult that had already developed around Lenin himself. And in fact, Stalin exploited this. He built up the cult of Lenin. When Lenin died, he took charge of the funeral arrangements. He wanted to have complete control of what happened to Lenin's legacy. It was Stalin who wanted Lenin's body to be embalmed, much against the wishes of Lenin's widow. And once Lenin was dead, this personality cult was transferred onto Stalin himself, and this would become one of the hallmarks of his entire reign of power in the Soviet Union.
Stalin was left as the sort of leading member of the leadership, along with Trotsky. And there were other major figures, Zinoviev and Kamenev, and younger ones like Bukharin as well, and Rykov, who were also key figures. But the leading two contenders were Stalin and Trotsky. And even though this is always presented as one of the great sort of struggles, and it was an amazing thing that Stalin won this succession struggle, actually, he'd really already won it by the time Lenin died. He was already the leading figure in the regime. And, somebody had to do something pretty radical to stop him. He already controlled the party machine, and the party controlled the country. So Trotsky was actually his ideal competitor. Trotsky was very arrogant and so famous and so preeminent and so pleased with himself that he really believed that he didn't need to do much organizing, and he would simply be given the leadership.
The first thing he did was to tell Trotsky he needed a rest and suggested that Trotsky go to the Caucasus. And Trotsky, who, although a very powerful figure, could be at times hysterical and have fainting fits and feel suddenly psychosomatically ill, Trotsky consented and he went pheasant shooting. And the instructions Stalin sent to the locals was he was not to meet anybody, he was not to receive any telegrams or letters. So Trotsky missed Lenin's funeral. And you know, people who miss funerals miss the will reading and miss the distribution of the spoils.
Stalin's maneuvers during Lenin's funeral would be the beginning of the end for Leon Trotsky's role in the newly formed USSR, and the beginning of Stalin's radical plans for the nation.
Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev forced Trotsky into exile. Then Stalin overrules his two associates and ends the new economic policy. In its place come three successive five-year plans, all designed to emphasize productive capacity, especially heavy industry and power output. From 1928 to 1941, Russia's industrial capacity rises nearly 300%.
After the Civil War, Lenin had promoted a policy of compromise, economic compromise, the new economic policy, which allowed quite a lot of market forces to delay communism because the country was so impoverished. And of course, in the Communist Party, there was a wide variety of views about which way they should go, whether they should allow some market forces or whether they should have a strict communism with collectivization. But at the same time, another big issue was industry. And the Tsars had begun to industrialize Russia in the 1890s, but of course that had all been destroyed in the war. And so now they looked towards America, the rising power, and they saw this extraordinary industrial miracle that was happening in America with mass production, and they wanted it too.
But while the Soviet Union wanted to emulate the industrialization witnessed in countries like the United States of America, it remained very wary of its precarious place in international affairs.
Well, the Bolshevik Party, which became the Communist Party, was split in its foreign policy. Those on the left believed that a revolution in one country could not survive only by itself, so they believed that only a world revolution could bring real socialism. So they believed that Britain, Germany, France, the United States also needed to become socialist in order to make the revolution succeed. And so part of the party policy was to organize and support foreign communist parties, to undermine governments, and to carry out this revolution. But at the same time, the Soviet Union needed to survive in the world that existed, so they were also engaging in diplomatic relations with these powers, trying to arrange trade deals so that they could borrow technology in order to develop their own economy. So there was this two-pronged policy. On the one hand, they were being nice to capitalist countries, and on the other hand, they were trying to undermine them with their local communist parties.
The foreign policy, changed, and he was extremely flexible with the foreign policy. But the essential thing was just to strengthen the Soviet Union wherever possible, by any means possible. And in that sense, he was actually he was very radical internally. He was incredibly murderous internally. But outside in foreign policy, he was, very much a traditional statesman, making alliances, winning friends, trying to win territory in order to make the USSR great.
The early years of the Soviet Union, both Lenin and Stalin after him really craved foreign recognition. They wanted this new revolutionary state to be recognized by countries across the world. One of the first nations to enter into negotiations was Great Britain, and you get the Anglo-Soviet trade agreement. And then you get diplomatic recognition happens soon afterwards. And eventually, America itself in the early 1930s will recognize this new state and send an ambassador to Moscow. And soon after that, the Soviet Union is recognized by the League of Nations in 1934. This is a key moment for the Soviet Union. At last, it's been recognized as an official country on the world stage.
While the USSR would eventually be officially recognized on the world stage, it continued to have extremely tense relationships with foreign powers. But one of the USSR's surprising opportunities for industrial development in this time was with the country it had been in direct conflict with just a few years prior during World War I, Germany.
Germany, after the First World War, was a pariah state. It wasn't allowed to have an army, wasn't allowed to have tanks or aeroplanes. So it came to agreement with another pariah state, the Soviet Union, and they developed submarines, tanks, and aircraft in various sites on the Volga.
Well, this was the first socialist country in the world, so it was a tremendous experiment in transforming an economic system, modernize the country to build hydroelectric dams, to build the economy. The Soviet economic elite decided that centralized economic planning would be the most efficient way to mobilize resources. So targets were set for every sector of the economy by the center, and orders were given to all parts of the economy to fulfill their parts of the plan. So initially, they recognized that they needed to build infrastructure and heavy industries, the transportation, energy sector, and machine manufacturing in order to provide the capacity to then develop the economy further into consumer goods and a broad-based economy. But everything was mobilized toward the plan.
And so Stalin, in the end, embraced the extreme leftist view of communism, which was collectivize, eliminate all property, but also to make this into a great power and to promote industrialization. And the best way to do that was to collectivize the fields and the farms and then sell the grain abroad and buy technology to industrialize the country. And that was the policy he decided on. So it was a radical policy. And by about 1928, he decided that that was the only way to go, to make the Soviet Union a great power and to ensure the survival of the USSR. And that was what he decided to do. And he would do it at any cost.
The economic policy enacted by Joseph Stalin in the late 1920s would lead to a wide-scale famine across the whole of the USSR.
He did it by, first of all, introducing a policy of collective farms. They had been tried briefly in the 1920s and found that peasants didn't want to have their horses owned collectively and rebelled against it, and that was quickly abandoned. And then he tried again in 1929, and this time it was organized with the help of the Red Army, and it is said for the first time in Russian history, peasants ate all the meat they wanted to, because rather than hand over their pigs and sheep and cows, they just had an enormous feast and ate as much as they could.
One of both Lenin's policies and Stalin's policies was the destruction of the wealthy farming class, the yeoman farmers, if you like. These are farmers who had quite a lot of land and produced a lot of produce which they would then sell on. This was deemed unacceptable to the Bolshevik regime, and they were to be liquidated. And other farmers, the smaller peasant farmers, were to be gathered into collective farms and produce grain and supplies for the benefit of the state. This was an absolute disaster because on the one hand, Stalin had wiped out the one class of farmers that produced a surplus, and there was no longer any incentive for the rest of the peasant farmers to produce any food that was going to be taken from them anyway. What happens next is the Great Famine of the early 1930s.
The regime would not listen to signals from below. They wouldn't listen to the fact that there was no seed to plant, and they insisted on high quotas anyway. And this led to an even worse harvest the next year with loss of life and devastation, mostly in Ukraine because this was the main grain growing area, but it would also affected parts of southern Siberia and eastern Russia as well. So historians who have looked very closely at this don't believe this was a deliberate attack on Ukrainian nationalism or Ukrainian independence. It was just a terribly tragic manifestation of mistakes made in economic planning and an unwillingness to collect unbiased information, but rather trying to believe the most rosy predictions and reports rather than the actual reports.
Records weren't kept properly, but we know how many people died simply because of the census report, that in 1937 there are about 12 million people missing from the population. Well, they shot the people who took the census, and they had a new census which was faked. And the problem with this famine was that there was a depression going on all over Europe and so on, and there wasn't much demand for buying grain from the Soviet Union. So the price wasn't good. They had to sell more and more in order to finance their industrialization. So that famine killed an enormous number of people, between 10 million and perhaps 15 million, because it happened not only to Ukrainians, it happened to Russian farmers. There was a sort of insanity about it, the agricultural policy. And the workers, I think, party workers got quite cynical. They realized their job was to destroy. So vineyards were torn up and farms destroyed. Animals destroyed. The grain wasn't even stored properly. It rotted in great railway sidings. So it was a form of madness. But it did solve one problem. It got rid of the peasantry as a force. Those who survived were cowed.
But it was not just the peasantry that was terrorized. The very leadership of the government and the original Bolshevik revolutionaries would also be targeted.
He would take his old Bolshevik comrades, many of whom had helped him maneuver him into the position of absolute power, and he would proceed to liquidate them in these show trials that took place in Moscow. Men like Kamenev, like Zinoviev were put on trial on trumped-up charges, and there was never any doubt that they were going to be found guilty. And he really went through many of his old Bolshevik comrades. They were put on trial, they were found guilty, and they were executed. It was absolutely brutal.
These are also the years of the great executions called Yezhovshchina, in honor of Stalin's executioner, N.I. Yezhov. How many people are permanently removed from circulation? No one knows. In some provinces, as much as 4% of the population vanishes. Kamenev and Zinoviev, who helped Stalin seize power, are quickly disposed of. To have been a friend of either one of them is now a crime. For this and related activities, well over half of the top communist leadership and thousands of lesser officials vanish, as do most of the army officers.
Well, the show trials were masterpieces of propaganda. They were meant to be public displays of crime and punishment, and they were carefully rehearsed, they were carefully prepared. Those that were sentenced in these trials, their confessions were scripted. Hundreds of people were invited to witness them. They were covered by the media, and they were an attempt to prove to the people at large that there were enemies in the country, and that Stalin was doing a good job of finding them and rooting them out. It was also a demonstration to foreign governments that the Soviet Union was intent on preserving its integrity.
And Stalin was helped by his chief of police at the time, who was a decadent poet and who had a lot to do with the theatre. And if you know the Stanislavski method of acting, which still survives today, the Stanislavski method of acting is very destructive for the actor because it tells the actor, you've got to be whoever you are. And prisoners, when arrested and interrogated, were trained just as Stanislavski trained actors. Their trials were rehearsed. So when they appeared in court, they would say, yes, I'm terribly guilty. I've been a Japanese spy all my life. And they would then, of course, make mistakes, saying they'd met somebody in a hotel which hadn't existed for 40 years. A lot of foreigners were convinced, quite influential foreigners, historians like Christopher Hill, Bernard Shaw, people who you thought had more brains, were convinced, oh, if he says he's guilty, he must be guilty.
A very few of Yezhov's victims are given trials. Some of the trials are remarkable. For example, several defendants are convicted of conspiring with Trotsky in 1936 in the Hotel Bristol in Copenhagen. In actual fact, in 1936, the hotel was no longer in business. Next case, in 1938, Yezhov himself is purged, together with many purged judges, labor camp operators, and the like.
His basic plan was, you know, when he looked at the Soviet Union, he saw there was disloyalty in the party. A lot of people wanted to get rid of him. A lot of people weren't happy with his collectivization policy and the suffering of the peasants. You know, there was disloyalty in his own family. And, you know, also the party bosses had become like little princes running their own territories. So he decided the way to deal with this was by bloodshed, by terror, quite deliberately. And he launched the Great Terror in 1935-36, in which over 1 million people, basically innocent, were executed.
This is also a time when there's a great expansion of the gulags. These are prison camps, often in far-flung places in Siberia, miles from anywhere, where political prisoners, troublemakers, or anyone deemed to be hostile to the regime would be sent off there, often walking there under unspeakable conditions, and they'd be simply locked away. And they'd have to work. They were forced labour camps. They were fed very little food. They were held in the most primitive conditions. In the depths of winter in Siberia, it was freezing cold, and millions, maybe 1.5 million, 2 million people died in these camps. But it meant that by the end of the 1930s, Stalin was absolute master of the Soviet Union. He had simply wiped out anyone who could challenge his leadership.
Some 2,000 delegates who were at the 1934 Communist Party Congress, 2/3 of them would have lost their lives by the end of the Great Terror. So the leadership was disproportionately targeted. But there were many other victims as well. Other whole groups of victims were members of national minorities who could be suspected of disloyalty in case a war came. So there was a German minority in Russia that had been there for 200 years. It was feared they would be disloyal. So they were rounded up and executed. Poles living on the borderlands between the Soviet Union and Poland, it was feared that they would turn on the Soviet Union in case of a war, so they were also targeted and victimized, not for anything they did, but just for the language that they spoke, basically.
So it was a completely cynical thing. It went on for about 18 months, and then there were several incidents which even Stalin realized made it impossible to go on. For instance, there was a low-temperature laboratory in Moscow, and they'd arrested so many of the scientists that it was about to explode and destroy a large amount of the new Russian underground that was being built. And so they decided to reverse things. The little chief of police, Nikolai Yezhov, had become a drunk, completely drunk, and was stopping to turn up for work. And Stalin decided to get rid of him. So the Great Terror came to a fairly sudden end towards the end of 1938. And 1939 became a sort of almost paradise year in which you could write what you liked, you could walk the streets, you could say what you liked, and nobody seemed to be bothered. It didn't last long, but it was an extraordinary period, 1939. If you look at the books that were published then, and you can see Stalin started relaxing. After the Great Terror, he was in some ways morally exhausted. It may be that he realized that it couldn't go on, that he'd be left with no population to rule.
By the late 1930s, the changing nature of Europe refocused Stalin and the USSR's attention on global rather than internal affairs.
The great hope at the outset of the Bolshevik Revolution was that this would spread to other countries, notably Germany, which was seen as ripe for a similar sort of Bolshevik revolution. But it didn't happen, and events changed rapidly in the 1930s. Germany becomes the dominant power in Europe. Hitler is the dominant personality in Europe, and Stalin recognizes this.
Stalin wanted to safeguard the Soviet Union as much as possible. He regarded Hitler as his first enemy, but he also regarded the Western democracies, France and Britain and America, as capitalist enemies, who after all had intervened to try and destroy the Soviet Union in the Civil War. So he was very suspicious of them, perhaps more suspicious of them. At least, I suppose, he thought that the Nazism, a fascist movement opposed to communism, at least came from revolutionary popular roots and was run by a leader, a single leader like himself with whom he could do business. And so as war became closer and the pressure rose in Europe, he needed to make a decision on sides.
Stalin's ultimate decision would be made behind closed doors when Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister of Nazi Germany, headed to Moscow in August of 1939 to meet with his Soviet equivalent, Vyacheslav Molotov. A pact between the two nations was being prepared.
In 1939, Stalin accepted that sooner or later he was going to have to fight Hitler. But he did not believe that either it suited the Soviet Union for it to happen soon, or that the Soviet Union was ready to do so. he also saw the opportunity for territorial booty in Finland, in Romania, in Poland, which he was happy to seize. And Stalin convinced himself that he was offering Hitler such a good deal with oil, wheat, and many other commodities of which Germany was in desperate need, that he was confident that it was going to be left to him, Stalin, and the Soviet Union to choose the moment at which he confronted Hitler in arms. What he did not recognize was that his timetable and Hitler's timetable might not mesh.
In the end, Stalin's predictions about the timetable of the war in Europe would prove disastrously wrong. In August 1939, it was publicly announced that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany had signed a non-aggression pact. The news would cause shockwaves around the world.
The lights began to burn all night in Moscow. British and French military missions arrived to confer with the Soviet government. So did German representatives. And on August 21st, 1939, the world was set on its heels by the announcement of a treaty between the Russians and the Germans in which they agreed not to fight each other. Here were the admitted arch-enemies in a state of apparent friendship. It was too fantastic to make any sense. It didn't.
When the news of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was announced to the world was absolutely stunned. This had all taken place in secret. All the negotiations had taken place behind closed doors. No one could quite believe in the West that Stalin would do a deal with his arch-enemy, Hitler. But also, inside the Soviet Union, there was deep and profound shock that Hitler, who'd been presented by the regime as the ultimate monster, suddenly Stalin was sitting down and doing a deal. Not just a deal, but signing a non-aggression pact with him.
Well, Stalin and the Soviet leaders were very much afraid of Hitler's intentions, starting from when Hitler came to power in 1933 with an avowed anti-communist platform. One of the first things Hitler did was to outlaw the German Communist Party and imprison the German communists. It was starting in 1936, therefore, the Soviet Union adopted a policy of support for popular fronts, trying to rally all socialists and all moderates in popular fronts against fascism. So they were very much trying to join an international coalition to fight Nazism and to fight fascism. From 1936 to 1939, Stalin was trying to join various collective security pacts with Britain and with France, but they were not letting him in. And when Stalin was excluded from the Munich agreements, he began to feel that he was going to be excluded from any protection that collective security might give the Soviet Union. So then they started negotiating on the other side for some sort of pact with Hitler that would protect them.
Many communists in Western Europe and in the United States were deeply bewildered by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This was something completely unexpected, something they could not reconcile with their enormously high ideals. But in the end they did so. They believed that the Comintern and the Kremlin must know what they were doing, and so they went along with it. But it did sow extraordinary confusion in the minds of Western communists.
So it was a cynical thing to do, to suddenly announce that the Germans were your friends and to start imprisoning people that you denounced Hitler in their books and articles at Communist Party dictate. And for 2 years, of course, this was official policy. We collaborate with Hitler because at least he's fighting the capitalist West.
Just over a week after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was announced, Nazi Germany invaded the western half of Poland, marking the beginning of World War II. Only a couple of weeks later, the Soviet Union took over the eastern half of Poland in exactly the way that the two nations had secretly agreed.
Part of Poland passed over to the Soviet Union, and the three independent Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were also handed over to the Soviet Union, which gave them more space between them and the expanding German Reich, which they hoped would help them if and when an invasion came.
He thought, and he did, he thought he'd get the Baltic states, he'd get half of Poland, And that half of Poland irritated him enormously, because it was the half of Poland he had lost in 1920 when he was in charge of the war there, and it had been settled by Polish officers. So he took great care when under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he was entitled to take over that part of Poland, to slaughter 22,000 Polish officers who were taken prisoners. And in fact, it made it much easier to cushion the eventual Nazi invasion.
The invasion of the Soviet Union itself would occur on the 22nd of June 1941, when Operation Barbarossa was launched on Hitler's orders.
One of the most extraordinary stories of the Second World War is that in Germany, Stalin, through communist sympathizers, had the most superb intelligence of any service, any nation in the Western world. And all his spies in Germany were telling him repeatedly that Hitler was going to attack him. And they told him so with the utmost authority, with the best information. And all of this information was getting through to Moscow, and Stalin absolutely refused to believe it.
He'd been warned by Churchill himself, had sent intelligence to Stalin saying that this is going to happen. And most importantly, he'd been warned by his spies in Tokyo, notably Richard Sorge, had told him not only that Hitler was going to invade, but he'd actually told him the exact date on which the invasion was going to take place. Stalin refused to believe this and dismissed these accounts as fabricated, and it meant that the Red Army was totally unprepared.
Hitler and Stalin read the same books. One of them is Clausewitz on war. Clausewitz fought with Napoleon, realized Napoleon's mistake was to fight on two fronts, in Spain and in Russia. Well, Stalin concluded, if Hitler's read this, he knows. I've read it, I know. You only fight on one front. Hitler is busy fighting Britain and France. When he's finished with them, then we can have a war, but he's not going to attack me until he's finished with them. And on that basis, Stalin made one of the biggest mistakes he ever made.
When the invasion came on the 22nd of June 1941, where the Wehrmacht rolled over the Soviet frontier on a massive 1,600-mile front, millions of men, tanks, machinery rolling over, this stunned Stalin. Stalin had no idea that Hitler was going to invade his country. It came as a deep and profound shock.
Stalin's behavior immediately in the aftermath of the invasion of June 1941 was quite extraordinary. He went into seclusion for days. Many people afterwards believed that his comrades were going to kill him, literally kill him, murder him, assassinate him, execute him, because he was alone responsible for this extraordinary crime, this extraordinary folly of allowing Germany a free pass almost into the Soviet Union with that invasion. And so all these frightened men around him who Stalin was expecting to kill him, for the first few days, they too were in chaos. They too were bewildered. They too couldn't think what to do. And in the end, Stalin rallied. Stalin came round. Stalin began once again, at first cautiously, at first rather nervously, to exercise his authority.
At first, Stalin faced astonishing losses. I think something like 6 million men were lost in the first year of warfare. And Hitler raced towards Moscow, towards Leningrad, into Ukraine, towards Kharkov, taking everything before him, before the Russians started to sort of gather a proper resistance and started to fight back and stop them, which they only managed to do in October 1941 outside Moscow. But before then, it looked like everything was collapsing. And Stalin himself said, Lenin left us a state and we've screwed it up. And for a second, he doubted that whether he could do this. And they came and got him and said, his henchmen came and got him and said, we need you to take control. And when that happened, it was as if the mistake of being surprised by Hitler was forgiven. And he was able to start with a clean state, and he did.
But as the German army moved ever closer towards Moscow in 1941, it seemed to many that just 2 decades after its formation, the Soviet Union was on the brink of annihilation.